Hello, this is a quick revision video on the unemployment section of Economics A2 Level Unit 4. For unemployment, we can use the same definition that we used at GCSE and AS level. It's just when there's people who are willing and able to work who are unable to find jobs at the current wage rate. So for example, June might be trained as a builder, she might be all ready and raring to go, I don't even know how you pronounce that, and she can't find a job. The only work she's offered is illegal work earning £3 an hour. She's unemployed. The natural rate of unemployment is when the aggregate demand for labour is equal to the aggregate supply of labour. So basically there's no cyclical unemployment, no demand efficient unemployment, that sort of thing. There's only a bit of voluntary unemployment, so if people want to be housewives, house husbands, they may be students and stuff. And frictional unemployment, so people are moving between jobs, they're happy doing that. There are two main ways of measuring unemployment, both of which I'm sure you're going to have met before. There's the claimant count and the labour force survey. The claimant count includes people who are eligible to claim job seekers allowance, but it doesn't include people who are unable to claim, for example, job seekers allowance. So for example, I watched a documentary about a woman that was unemployed 2 years before she was about to retire, and because she had such big savings, they weren't even that big, but they were just savings she was saving up for her retirement to go on holiday and stuff, she wasn't actually allowed to claim job seekers allowance. They said, you've got savings, you can live off them. So for the last 2 years of her working life, when she could have been working, because there was no jobs available, she had to spend all of that money that she'd saved up for her retirement, and the government refused to give her job seekers allowance because they thought, you don't need it, which obviously doesn't really seem too fair. It's a difficult one. And then the labour force survey is basically a survey that's a sample of households are given, and it counts the number of people that are looking for work in the past month. I've never seen one, so that's what maybe it looks like, maybe it doesn't, no idea. The labour force survey will typically give a higher figure for unemployment in the claimant count because it includes people that are unable to claim benefits. Here is a rainbow list of the causes and types of unemployment. I'm going to try to go through them quite quickly, so you're probably already familiar with them, thanks to Adeeba who provided the names for the examples. Frictional unemployment occurs when workers are moving between jobs. It can be voluntary or involuntary. So if it's voluntary, for example, we might have got Alison. Alison wants to become an accountant and she's currently a vet. She might need to have a little period moving between the jobs. So if that's voluntary, maybe she wanted a 2-week break to get out of vet mode and into accountant mode, that sort of thing. That's frictional unemployment. Then we have sort of involuntary frictional unemployment, for example, due to geographical immobility. So we might have got Tyrone in one place and he's got a job as a fishmonger, and suddenly all the fish market in his area dries out, so he thinks, oh no, there's no jobs. But there might actually be fishmonger jobs elsewhere, and it might take him a bit of time to move from here to there. So that's geographical immobility of labour, so it's when people find it hard or it takes a long time for them to be able to move from one place to another, from where there aren't jobs to where there are jobs. The unemployment trap occurs when there's a high replacement ratio. The replacement ratio is the unemployment benefits that a person would be able to afford divided by the wage they'd make if they were in work. And if you've got a high value for this, then people think, there's no point working, I may as well claim benefits. For example, Draco could make $20,000 a year as an aura, but he might make $30,000 a year on benefits. That would be a lot to make on benefits, but that's just an example. And that means that there is a high unemployment replacement ratio because the benefits divided by the wage in work would be 30,000 divided by 20,000, which is 1.5. Basically, any value greater than 1, you're better off taking benefits. In the short term, at least, you're better off taking benefits than working. Obviously, in the long term, it's better to get a job because that allows progression up the ladder, but in the short term, you'd make more money claiming benefits. Casual/seasonal is when workers are sort of laid off on a short-term basis. The biggest example of this is tourism. For example, we've got Bonkisha. Bonkisha works as a ski instructor. Bonkisha is obviously not going to be able to work in the summer because there is no snow, so he is going to be, or she is, I don't even know. Adeeba's given me these names, I don't even know what gender they go with. Bonkisha is unable to work. I just looked it up and I still can't work it out, though I did look up the name meaning and some of the things they've given are hilarious. Not that I can judge, I think mine's like, God is my judge or something, and I'm atheist, so anyway, we have totally diverged, that was a massive tangent there. So seasonal, essentially, if they can only work in part of the year because the rest of the year there are no jobs. So, for example, summer workers can't work in winter and winter workers can't work in summer, although I suppose they could get training to work for both. But often with ski instructors, for example, it's different training that's needed to be a lifeguard, that sort of thing. Structural unemployment occurs when there's a long-term sort of decline in demand for labour relative to supply. Often happens in particular industries, and it can be due to deindustrialisation. For example, say we had loads of mines, and we had this lovely guy called Arthur. He might not even be lovely. We had Arthur working in the mines, and then someone called Maggie thought, I know, I'm going to shut the mines, and that led to the sort of collapse of the mining industry, and Arthur's lost his job. Arthur is structurally unemployed. Also, it could be technological sort of structural unemployment, so that's when workers are replaced by machines. So one day Tracy is painting plant pots. Next thing you know, there's this machine that can do it instead, and Tracy, alas, technologically unemployed. Voluntary unemployment, we looked at it a bit earlier when we did the sort of replacement ratio, the unemployment trap. Also voluntary if people want to work as a sort of housewife or house husband, that sort of thing. So you choose not to work, or maybe you've got a massive inheritance. So say we've got, I don't know, Elizabeth. That's not even that posh name. I want a really posh name, but oh well. Elizabeth has got a massive inheritance of 2 million quid. She doesn't need to work, so she chooses not to. She's voluntarily unemployed. Involuntary is the opposite, so maybe Jessica really wants to work, but she can't find a job. So when you're involuntarily unemployed, it's when you really want to work, but you're unable to find a job at existing wage rate. So it's basically the same as the definition of unemployment that we looked at earlier. Classical unemployment occurs when real wages are above the market clearing level. This happens a lot due to the minimum wage. I mean, I'm in favour of the minimum wage, but it does lead to unemployment because sometimes workers are paid more than market clearing. So you've got an excess supply of labour compared to demand, but the price is sort of fixed at an artificial level, so that means that loads of people are left without jobs. There's some quite interesting stuff you can read up on it to do with efficiency wages and why there's always going to be some level of unemployment. I think it's Yellen and Akerlof, or might be Schiller, one or the other. Yeah, they wrote a really interesting paper on it. So what are the costs of unemployment? The main costs are economic, so the loss of potential output is a big one. If we've got people who are unemployed, they're being wasted. They're like potential output that could be provided isn't being provided, so we've essentially wasted them. And if we say they're a scarce resource, we've essentially wasted scarce resources. So we're working inside our production possibility boundary, and we're not reaching our maximum potential output. We're not on our long run aggregate supply curve, that sort of thing. You can draw that out on diagrams and make it look impressive, get loads of marks. Also, negative multiplier effect. If there's unemployment, there's a fall in confidence, fall in spending, fall in A&D, fall in aggregate demand. It just goes down, negative multiplier effect, and more people get unemployed, which isn't really great for the government because it leads to a rise in the budget deficit. They have to pay more out in benefits and they get less in income tax revenue. Not good. Social costs. Hysteresis. I really like that name because it sounds kind of hysterical. Basically, if people aren't in work, they sort of lose their worker skills. So if you're out of work for 6 months, you sort of fall behind on technological developments in the industry, that sort of thing. So in the future, you're less likely to get a job. So you get to a stage where some people just drop out of the market altogether because they've been out of work for so long. So that's hysteresis. And then there's regional costs of unemployment. You often get unemployment centralised in one particular place in certain locations, particularly around old mining villages. You get quite a bit of unemployment still. So in those areas you tend to find there's more crime and worse health, and particularly worse mental health. So obviously that's more money that the government has to spend on mental health services. Looking for benefits of unemployment is like scraping the barrel. There's very little you can say that's great about unemployment. One thing is that there is less pressure for firms to increase wages because there are so many people they can choose from. Supplies increased, which sort of pushes down wages rather than forcing them up. So in times of inflation, that can be a good thing. So that leads to a reduced risk of inflation. I love how that's two separate points when it's really the same point. It was just a depressingly empty slide. Environmental stuff can also be good because less production in times of unemployment if the unemployment is due to demand deficiency. So say we've got a lack of demand for stuff to be produced, meaning there's people unemployed. We'll be producing less, so we'll have less negative externalities from production, though it seems to be sort of a tenuous link because that's more to do with the lack of demand than the unemployment. I suppose the lack of demand could be as a result of negative multiplier effect unemployment. It's just if you're looking for something and you need to put it, but hopefully not. And then that also goes with less use of scarce resources. You're producing less, so there's less wasted trees. They're not even scarce, they regrow. Less wasted natural gas. That's a good one. GCSE chemistry. I genuinely don't know why that tree's there, because it's not scarce and it's not a negative externality. It's just a pretty bad tree. So, what can the government do to reduce unemployment? They can do two sort of sides to it. They can do the demand side and the supply side. If they increase demand in the economy, that leads to greater demand for goods and services, so we need more people employed to produce them. So to increase demand, you'll increase AD through fiscal measures and monetary measures, and hopefully that'll lead to a multiplier effect. So fiscal could be cutting tax, increasing benefits, that sort of thing. And monetary would typically be reducing the interest rate to encourage people to spend rather than save. Also regional incentives, so essentially telling firms to locate in areas of high unemployment, so you might give them tax breaks or that sort of thing. Then we have supply side policies, so reducing occupational and geographical immobility is quite a big thing. I know we talked about geographical earlier, so there's jobs elsewhere. So if you have put maybe a housing scheme in place, that can encourage people to move houses and go to a place where there might be work. It makes people less sort of stuck in one place, although you can't really do much to get rid of the family ties and that sort of thing. And then reducing occupational immobility, that's when people have got the skills for one job, but that's not the job that's available and there's another job available, so giving them training and education is a big one there. And at the bottom, reducing welfare benefits and reducing income tax for the poor or for those who are on the lower end of the income spectrum. That will encourage people to go into work. So essentially incentives. I love that word, incentives. I don't think my voice has ever been so annoying on a video. It feels really croaky and I'm not even ill. Here is the Phillips curve, which is an economic model that shows the sort of inflation unemployment trade-off. I don't like it as a model much, but it's on the spec, so I suppose you just have to get on with it and learn it. Say we've got unemployment, then the government might try to increase aggregate demand to reduce this unemployment, and essentially it might push it up too far, and then we'll have inflation. And this inflation could sort of spiral up if trade unions are confident and push for wage rises and that sort of thing, so a wage price spiral could happen. So that's sliding leftwards along the curve from high unemployment to high inflation. It can also go the other way, so say we've got high inflation, people are likely to be less confident and reduce their spending, so demand's going to be falling. If demand's falling, there's less need for workers to do the jobs to produce the stuff that people were previously demanding, so that leads to unemployment. So that is a shift from a period of high inflation to a period of unemployment. Obviously, as demand falls, prices fall, so inflation comes down as unemployment rises. I really don't like this model, but it's quite straightforward to explain, especially compared to the expectations augmented Phillips curve, which we'll come on to in a second. I think I thought I was being really funny when I drew that a few months ago. I actually made this presentation ages ago. I don't know why I've only just made this video. But yeah, that's a that's a Harry Potter joke, if anyone gets it. I'm not sure I get it. Anyway, stagflation is when there's high inflation and high unemployment. And this disproves the Phillips curve that we had before, because obviously if there's high inflation and high unemployment, where does that go on the graph? It doesn't. It's sort of floating out there in the middle of nowhere. So that's essentially something that a lot of people think disproves the original Phillips curve in the sort of long term. So in the long run, the Phillips curve should be drawn as vertical, and we'll see that on the next slide. Although the Phillips curve can sort of shift leftwards and inwards if you have supply side improvements. So I'm just going to show that next. Here is the expectations augmented Phillips curve. We're going to assume that the economy is at A at the moment. So we've got the natural rate of unemployment. So we're at A, so that's U2, the natural rate of unemployment, and we've got low inflation. And the government thinks, I would like to reduce unemployment. And there's two ways it can do it. It could try to increase aggregate demand, to try to boost demand in the economy, so people will be spending and there'll be more need for workers to be employed. Or it can try to increase the sort of amount we need to supply, so it can try to increase aggregate supply. What it chooses to do in this diagram is increase aggregate demand. Now, a rise in aggregate demand will reduce unemployment, so we're going to move along the short-run Phillips curve 1 from A to B. And the reason that we've had an increase in inflation is because if we're increasing aggregate demand, we're going to be putting inflationary pressure on firms because they probably won't be able to quite keep up with the rise in the level of demand, so that tends to lead to a rise in price. And now we're at B. Because unemployment has fallen, firms are going to be paying their workers more wages in order to attract the best workers and to keep them. And so workers will be thinking that they're being paid more, but in reality this is money illusion because prices are also going to be rising because firms are going to have to raise their prices in order to pay the workers the higher wages. And this is money illusion. And so for a while we might be comfortable at B, and then suddenly people will think, I'm not actually being paid more at all. And they'll all sort of see through the money illusion. I really don't like this concept, but that's what the textbook says anyway. So everyone suddenly sees through this money illusion. They think, and there is a fall in confidence. So people suddenly think, oh, this is really bad. Firms sort of see a fall in confidence as well, so they might start laying off workers, which is why we've got the shift from B to C. So unemployment will rise again. And now we're at C. So we've got the same level of inflation, and we have the same unemployment that we had before. So higher inflation and high unemployment. This is stagflation, essentially. And because we're now in the long run curve, we can think about long run consequences. If we've got high unemployment, it's unlikely that prices are going to sort of stay at the same price level because people are going to be spending less due to the underconfidence often associated with unemployment. So prices will slowly come down, so we'll eventually go back from C to A. And we'll be back to where we started. So, not much fun at all, but this seems to happen over and over again according to this diagram. So what a lot of economists think is that for governments to reduce unemployment, they should really tackle aggregate supply rather than aggregate demand. And the ideal place for an economy to be is at the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So this means that there's no tendency for inflation to accelerate or decelerate in either direction. So it's a safe position. So inflation will stay stable, unemployment will stay stable. Kind of sucks if you're in the 5% that are unemployed though. So at the moment we've got about 5% for our NAIRU. If we are below the NAIRU, we're going to have more people employed than is a sort of sustainable level for us to have. So this is going to put pressure on prices, quite a lot of pressure, because demand is going to be rising faster than supply. So this will lead to inflation. If we're below the NAIRU, we're going to have less people employed than would be sufficient to maintain prices at the current level. So that will lead to a fall in inflation, possibly deflation. So the safest place for sort of price stability is to be on the NAIRU. Obviously this can change over time due to various consequences, and it's ideal to have as low a NAIRU as possible, although you always want a bit of leeway with unemployment because you probably want about 2%, so frictional unemployment and that sort of thing. Before 2008, when everything went horribly wrong, the UK actually had fairly stable sort of inflation, so relatively low inflation, relatively low unemployment. So here are some of the reasons why. In another rainbow. You're going to have so many rainbows in this series. I like rainbows. So we had labour market flexibility. So firms were very easily able to hire and fire labour. It was easy for workers to move between jobs, and part of this was due to the reduction in the power of trade unions. So we had relatively weak trade unions, so firms felt much more able to fire labour if they didn't want it and get new labour in quite quickly. So this meant that skills were kept going around, people were constantly being trained, so there was an improvement in the sort of quality of the labour market as well. We also had quite a bit of immigration, so there was lots of inward migration, which relieved us of our labour shortages. So when we didn't have enough workers, there were always plenty of foreigners for us to say, come here, work for us. So immigration was actually really useful for us, and it prevented sort of wage price spirals and that sort of thing. We also had quite a strong sustainable monetary policy framework. We'd had a relatively stable economy, so we sort of had good predictions for what was going to happen. Obviously not that great, because then we had the recession, but we thought it was all fairly doodah and stuff, and we were all quite happy, and we knew what sort of inflation we were going to be getting and that sort of thing. So that was a sort of useful thing for us. Also useful for firms because they could see the sort of targets we'd made, and they expected the government to be able to meet such targets, so they knew when to hire and fire labour. and they had more confidence in their decisions. Low inflation was also happening not just here but around the globe. So if there was low inflation globally, this meant that the prices of imports were also cheaper, which meant that our own inflation within the economy was cheaper. For example, things that we were producing weren't so expensive if we were producing them using imported raw materials and that sort of thing. And finally, technological developments. We had an efficient economy, increased labour productivity, that sort of thing. So production costs were falling, so prices didn't have to rise as much for firms to still make increased profits. Woo! That is the end of unemployment. I will see you next time for the fiscal policy. Hope you're having a lovely day, have a lovely evening, lovely life. Goodbye.